I think Kelly Reichardt's film Old Joy captures what it means to fail to communicate with someone you love. That internal anguish of, I want something from you, but I don't know how to ask for it. The film follows two old friends, Mark and Kurt, both in their late 20s or maybe early 30s. And in the time since their youth, Mark has gotten married, settled down in Portland, and his wife Tanya is now pregnant with their first child. He is stable, lives in a house, listens to political talk radio. Kurt, on the other hand, is a drifter. When Kurt calls Mark to plan a spontaneous weekend away to a remote hot spring, Mark thinks he's in for a reunion with an old pal, when, in fact, this is Kurt's life, living from moment to moment, car to car, town to town. There's very little that grounds Kurt. When we first see him on screen, he's crossing the street with a red wagon and cooler. Supplies for the hot springs trip. But the visual is suggestive of someone who's on the edge of society. Mark, meanwhile, is introduced to us in a moment of marital obligation. After the call from Kurt, Tanya sits with him as he explains that he doesn't have to go if it's going to be a problem for her. He then invites her to come along. The dialogue is played quietly, with each person looking the opposite direction, never meeting each other's gaze. We are introduced to Mark and Mark's shame, or guilt, or whatever he's imposing on himself that makes it difficult to tell his wife that he would very much like to see his old friend for the weekend. She's the most open of the two, saying the all-telling line, quote, "You're just waiting for me to tell you you can go," unquote, which silences Mark's meek invitation. Her quickness with this reply, and the fact that she is the more direct of the two in addressing their breakdown in communication, suggests a soreness of feeling for her that Mark can't seem to wrap his head around. It's a sad thing to watch a couple with so much tying them together, struggling to meet one another in conversation. When Mark eventually leaves to meet Kurt in the scene with the wagon, Kurt tells him about a dream he had last night. Quote, "You were in a hospital, but you were the best thing about it by far," unquote. The simplicity of communication Kurt brings with him stands in stark contrast to Mark and his wife. The men look one another in the eye, and while Kurt is undoubtedly less moored in life than Mark, that doesn't seem to matter to the friends. At least not at first. Like any road trip, tensions are fairly measured at the start, when all that's before you is the road, whatever music you brought along, and the potential for anything not ordinary to happen. Over the course of the long drive, we hear about Kurt's many exploits, most of them begging disbelief from Mark. His boasting is mostly impossible to verify, but there are few of the telltale lies that come from an insecure ego, such as Kurt's claim that he designed the menu for a hip new restaurant that Mark recently read about in a magazine. These falsehoods pass by almost like the trees that line the road, enveloping their conversation in a sort of safety net. When your old friends tell you something you can't quite believe, do you call them on it? What if you haven't seen them in a while, and this is your only time together for the foreseeable future? Well then, it's easier to just let the lies happen. Nod your head at the trees, but let them pass by. Understand that to call each one by name would cause the trip to enter a quagmire that wouldn't really benefit either party. Before long, the pair is lost, and Mark steps out of the car to take a look at the map while Kurt rolls a joint. Eyes flicker up and down, casting and avoiding blame without words. The car door slams a little too loud when Mark gets out. Sighs seem to emanate at a pitch just audible enough for the vibe to shift from positive to tense. Mark begins walking up the road, seemingly looking for a marker or sign that would tell them where they are, when Kurt motions for him to come back. Mark's wife, or as Kurt says, the mother of your child, is calling. Mark eagerly jogs back to the car and picks up, then begins walking back up the road. "It's fine," he mutters. "We just have no idea where we are." We're seeing Mark's guilt and shame return, but this time it is split between his wife and Kurt. He is honest with Tanya about their physical location, but not about his frustration with Kurt's attitude or constant fibs. Mark is an incredibly insular person, but he is also a careful person, which I can certainly relate to. Being trapped in a phone conversation with someone you love, where the subject of the conversation is within earshot or even in the room, is an experience I find myself in more often than I'd like, and it always puts me in a state of tension. My shoulders freeze up, the phone feels glued to my ear, as if removing it and simply having the conversation later would confirm that I am, in fact, uncomfortable talking about the subject who is in the room, which I do not want to admit. Mark is protecting both his wife's and Kurt's feelings in this awkward phone conversation. This is all pretty standard relationship dialogue, but I appreciate that Reichardt and co-writer John Raymond see it as standard dialogue worth focusing on, worth examining for the little glares and gestures we make to preserve others' feelings, often at the expense of our own. We don't hear much more of their conversation, and then the connection fails. Mark returns to the car and pokes his head in the window to tell Kurt that he spotted a blank road sign up ahead, jokingly adding that they have, quote, entered a whole other zone, unquote. Which, of course, they have. Kurt's knowing looks and isolation in the car as Mark takes the call shows his awareness of Mark's frustration with him, perhaps even with his lies and overall unconcerned attitude. Mark also seems to be aware that Kurt may suspect he is talking to his wife about him, so he adds a little joke about their location in order to steady the ship. But rather, it is what Mark did not say to his wife that plants the seed for future conflict between the two men. I said that I relate to Mark, and this is the attribute of his character that I can understand most. That terribly anxious trap of being aware that someone may be upset with you, while also being too nervous or polite to bring it up outright and let it dance in the light of day. His feelings remain hidden from us, internalized and diverted for the moment. Kurt behaves exactly opposite to Mark, and I do not relate to him at all. But I can see the appeal of a personality like Kurt's, because somewhere in between his grandstanding and ego-stroking is an open, unafraid person. One who may feel the need to exaggerate, but is seemingly not afraid of taking risks or sharing his emotions. As the first day of the road trip comes to a close, and the two set up a roadside camp, it is Kurt who broaches the topic of Mark's soon-to-be fatherhood, casually dropping the idea into a campfire discussion as the two share beers. Mark has a quick response, which again recalls moments in my own life where I am expecting to be asked a difficult question by someone, so the easiest logical step for my brain is to prepare a canned response that technically qualifies as an answer, but reveals very little about how I feel. When Kurt asks how he feels about having a child, Mark says, quote, "We'll just find another rhythm. Do whatever it is people do," unquote. Mark is protecting himself from having his difficult emotions exposed. But this answer could have been given to anybody, his boss at work or even a casual acquaintance. The speed at which he gives the answer is likely why Kurt doesn't push further, and the conversation moves on. But what do we learn about Mark's state of mind? That he is stretched financially? That he's unsure of how he and Tanya will make ends meet when their child is born? While these are certainly real struggles and worries people expecting children deal with every day, they don't tell us how Mark feels, but rather show the bare minimum of effort that he has thought about the future at least enough to not warrant concern from his friends. The conversation moves on as Kurt gets up and shoots empty beer cans with a toy air pistol, but Mark remains seated. The environment of the film, and of this scene in particular, plays a part in establishing the characters' fractured relationship, and if you're interested in reading more about that, there's a great article by Anna Hoppert Flores in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Film Journal that discusses Old Joy in the context of ecofilms and phenomenology much more directly and in depth than I do here. I'll put the link to that article in the description along with any other articles I cite in this video. I can imagine Mark's thoughts swirling, his head full of doubts and questions and fears regarding his future fatherhood, mixing in with the guilt and shame that have defined his scenes with Tanya. Is it horrible to admit that he is afraid of being a father? Would Kurt understand if he told him that? Maybe Kurt really wants to know, or maybe he's not the right person to tell. He is stuck inside himself, and it's not until Kurt starts talking bullshit again that Mark turns to look his friend in the eye. The scene uses jump cuts to show a back and forth montage of beers crushed, air pellets fired, and drunk personal stories that seem to have no bottom or sense of humility in their telling. Kurt talks about taking night classes, only he knew more than the professors did, so it really wasn't worth much to him. He even offers his own theory of space and time, and the camera closes in on Mark's reaction in close-up, giving a skeptical look. Quote, "I get it on a fundamental level," Kurt says. "The thing is that I have my own theory," unquote. In her chapter on the film, E. Don Hill discusses masculinities and the complexities that characterize Mark and Kurt, writing that, quote, "What makes Reichardt's character, Kurt, so much more complicated is not only his sexual ambiguity and liberal philosophies, but her use of realism and minimalism in his depiction. She scripted a realistic personality in Kurt whose flaws create a fluctuating distance effect on the viewer," unquote. In this moment, Kurt's ego and need to impress others are too noticeable to ignore, as he shows that despite communicating more than Mark, he is just as blind to his own faults. It's a constant ebb and flow with Kurt of coming closer, being pulled in by his easy demeanor and inviting attitude, and being pushed away by his convictions regarding his own perceived success. Their long-standing friendship has created a safe area where the two can be open, without fear of the other's judgment, which is why I think they do not call one another out on their behavior in this scene. But it is shocking for Mark to see Kurt ramble like this, raving practically. Mark has become entrenched in a hegemonically masculine world, which Hill writes has given him, quote, "a certain status in society, and whether happy or not, he has managed to achieve and affirm his access to power," unquote. Kurt sees this change immediately, making constant remarks about how Mark looks and acts, or bringing up now closed stores the two used to frequent, and the rebellious rituals they engaged in before Mark got married and had a child. It is likely just as shocking for Kurt to hear Mark's half-hearted musings on fatherhood, practically refusing to engage with any aspect of the topic that warrants conversation, like ethics or responsibility, or even just how are you dealing with the intense stress this situation is surely causing. I'm amazed that Reichardt and Raymond have written characters who are so real, so identifiably true to life, for even as they're protected by their friendship, Mark is also driven away from Kurt, pulled into his own thoughts and beliefs about himself at the expense of sharing those thoughts and feelings, while Kurt fills the empty space with his own delusions of grandeur that alienate the two even more. Kurt, now off a few beers and at least one joint, attempts to call out the tension between the two. Out of nowhere, he sighs and says, quote, "I miss you, Mark. I miss you really, really bad. I want us to be real friends again, but there's something between us, and I don't like it. I want it to go away," unquote. The raw, sudden exposing of the pair's tension pushes Mark further inward. Is it the naming of the tension that scares him so much? The two have grown apart, as so many people do, and are now perhaps more strangers than they are old friends. In the face of all this judgment, Kurt could come off as a one-note failed hippie, but actor Will Oldham plays the role with such kindness, so much pathos for the struggles of his friend, that it would be impossible to completely write him off. It's what makes his drunken plea for connection so powerful. The idea that in some deep, hidden place, Mark wants to be asked this question by his friend. Instead, his response solidifies the dynamic between the two that will carry throughout the rest of their ill-embarked road trip. He responds that they are, quote, "fine. There's no problem. They're totally fine." He repeats it a few times even, nudging Kurt on the shoulder to steady him. Kurt replies with a profusion of apologies. "Sorry, I'm just being crazy. I know. Don't pay any attention to me, okay? We're fine. Everything's totally fine." Ouch. What thoughts can you share with someone? When is it okay to be forthright when you sense tension? Is there a right or wrong way to address what you see as an issue in the friendship? Drunk and high is maybe not the most elegant state to relay your concerns, but Kurt is brave enough to voice them, and that should really be all that matters. I'm more sympathetic to Kurt in this scene because I can remember moments in my life where I've shared difficult feelings or thoughts, sometimes drunk or high, and been met with the usual reply. "It's okay. It's going to be all right. Nothing is wrong. I don't think others are wrong for responding like this, and I don't think Mark is either. Sometimes people like Kurt are just fishing for assurance or headed down a spiral of negative thought. But if Mark wanted to understand his friend better, and perhaps get to a place where he can be honest with him, he would bring up Kurt's question and feelings again at a less inebriated time. Or perhaps answer honestly in the moment and finally clear the air. He doesn't, providing another canned answer to a question that demands emotional honesty. Kurt's apology is a painful retreat from the edge of a breakthrough. He's not afraid of risk, but he has played his hand too strongly. At a breakfast diner the following morning, the tension is stronger than ever. Mark gets another call from Tanya, stepping out of the restaurant as the camera stays fixed on Kurt. He mocks Mark's breakfast order and phone call, venting frustration to any stranger who will listen. We see a snippet of Mark's call where he reiterates to Tanya that the two are still lost, reminding her of, quote, who they are dealing with here. It's hard to accept, but I can also recall moments where I have been Mark, having feelings dumped on me by someone who I wasn't sure how I felt about, and certainly wasn't prepared to engage with in the moment or afterward. Relationships are tricky, and try as anyone might to convince you that communication is all you need to succeed, that word can mean many different things for many different people. There is no rule book. We are just trying and often failing to be better people to one another. I think this is an opportune time to talk about Yo La Tengo's score, who happened to be one of my favorite bands. I honestly don't think I would have known it was them, as the music plays a small, almost ambient role in the background of only a handful of scenes. Country guitar licks are played strongly but sit quite low in the mix, alongside brushed drums and a small but full bass sound, making up a perfect soundtrack for the in-between moments of the story, for the moments when dialogue isn't necessary to hear and visuals pass by at cruising speed. There are more sinister-sounding notes too, but overall I find the score to be an incredibly appealing testament to the innate boundaries of a road trip. By embarking on one, you're essentially committing to being trapped with someone, or a group of someones, for a period of time that includes stops to sleep, eat, sightsee, or just linger in the boredom of the open road. There is baked-in time for talking, but also for music, which for me has been the constant I look forward to when going on a trip up the coast. What music will we listen to? What albums? What artists? Reichardt's decision to feature the music in this way as a sort of pseudo-diegetic soundtrack the characters themselves could be listening to fills in that necessary element of a road trip, at least for me. Mark and Kurt do eventually reach the hot spring, and it's quite something to behold. A well-put-together wooden structure nestled deep in the Oregon woods. Far from the road and requiring a hike to reach, the hot water can be called on command into two large hollowed-out tree trunks that act as baths. The whole thing resembles a treehouse, a magical, imaginary space where the real world is left behind and dreams take precedence. After a little while in the baths, Kurt steps out, lighting up another joint. The sights and sounds of nature are more present than before, as the poetry of the open road has faded into the even more secluded nest of the hot spring. Suddenly, Kurt begins a story. It's part ramble, part exploration of Kurt's feelings of anxiety about himself, part half-remembered dream that Kurt finds extremely meaningful. Not exactly the kind of story that starts a conversation, at least for someone like Mark. He sits and listens, but doesn't engage with the feelings Kurt raises about himself. His admittance that he is an anxious person who worries what others think of him, despite his rogue demeanor and appearance. Whether Mark is genuinely bored or just chooses not to respond isn't clear, but after completing the story, Kurt walks over and starts massaging Mark's shoulders. Mark immediately tenses up, clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy. There's a very suggestive shot of Mark's left hand, featuring his wedding ring, slipping from the side of the bath down into the murky water, as he finally relents and allows Kurt to continue massaging him. It would be easy to read into this that the men have a sexual encounter, and that might be the implication. They may have a sexual history, and that could be the reason why there's tension between Mark and his wife about Kurt leading up to the trip. I read the scene less literally, but it is an incredibly intimate moment to depict, and something of a breakthrough for the deeply insular Mark. Kurt is trying one last time to get his friend to open up, to finally relax and leave the stress in his mind behind. And while he still can't get him to engage on a verbal level, the intimacy of touch allows him into Mark's interior world, if only for a short time. It's a way for Kurt to say, I love you, that I don't care about getting anything back from this, that I want to help you let go in a direct, physical way. The slipping of Mark's hand into the water, to me, signifies the clearing of his mind, temporarily putting on hold the guilt and shame regarding his obligations to his wife and his judgments of Kurt, to indulge in a moment of pleasure, of physical experience in a private, relaxing place. It's the reason they came out here, after all. Mark has a lot to come back to as they begin their drive back to Portland, but for Kurt, this trip is his only concern. There's an imbalance in the friendship that likely didn't matter when they were younger, living off of other people's money, the world open to whatever they could imagine for themselves. Kurt has largely stayed in that place, keeping in touch with his own desires and emotions, but lacking the stability that has come to define and isolate Mark. As their trip ends and the last chance for escape from daily worries passes by, Mark must face the fact that he hasn't really given any of himself to Kurt. When Mark drops him off, it is one of the saddest final scenes of any film I've seen. The two exchange goodbyes outside Kurt's house, a house that is owned and soon to be sold by someone else, and draw out their inevitable separation. It's difficult to pry yourself away from the emotional space between old friends, even if part of you knows you're happy to no longer be accompanied by someone 24/7. Mark thanks Kurt for suggesting the trip, and Kurt heads off, leaving Mark to drive back home. We see only a few moments of Mark driving, the political talk radio back on, driving out the silence and serenity of the hot spring. His mind is back on daily worries, financial concerns. The radio voice says something like, uncertainty about the future and economic pressures in the present are combining to create our current societal climate. We then see Kurt, not at home, but walking on what looks like a main street, wandering in a stupor between the sidewalk and the road. He walks past a homeless man who asks for spare change, refuses him, then turns around and gives him some. In a tighter close-up, we see him step back and forth in the frame, as if waiting to cross the street. Then he steps out of the frame entirely, as the title card appears for the second time. I find the ending so sad because of how true it feels, but also how avoidable these specific circumstances feel. Had Mark only been able to open up about his feelings concerning fatherhood, to confide in his friend whose company he clearly enjoys, despite all the grandstanding, he might have ended in a more tranquil state of mind. Instead, we hear others thinking for him, the radio filling the space where his thoughts should be with incessant reminders of dismay, buzzwords that can stand in for a lot of things, but carry little emotional truth. Kurt's is a purely tragic image, as we are left unsure of his mental state, but also with concern for his safety. Does he have nothing else to do, nowhere else to go than the street? His dazed expression suggests an absence of feeling, as if leaving Mark has sent him into his own kind of mental crisis, unable to connect with others or to ask for help. At the end of their trip, they don't seem to know each other any better, but they are both lost in some respect. We hear the Yo La Tengo score once again played over the credits, returning our thoughts to memories of the in-between moments of the road trip. These are the moments that don't bear any weight, just necessary miles added to the odometer. That's not a bad note to end on, but it's a bittersweet one, as the characters have returned to worlds defined by isolation. I think a common experience at the end of any long-term trip, on the road or otherwise, is the feeling of being changed by the experience, closely followed by a return to everyday life that feels almost out of body. You're seeing yourself from a new perspective, from the outside in, perhaps reflecting or hyper-focusing on the issues that you face. Old Joy, and Mark and Kurt specifically as characters, represent that out-of-body experience for me, each of them reflecting the many conflicting desires and influences that interact throughout the course of a road trip. The desire to open up to a friend, anxiety preceding a new phase of life, struggles with anxiety and loneliness, all of this filtered through two men who seem almost ready to connect, but instead end in about the same place as they began. If they are changed by the trip, they keep it to themselves, leaving one another in neutral politeness. That's true to life, I think, as our lives are so rarely defined by the moments where we succeed in connecting with those we love. What are we really protecting by hiding ourselves from each other, though? Some sense of selfhood or personal pride? Maybe it's to preserve the notion that we have it all together, or that we're just on the verge of making the next step towards success, or happiness, or whatever expectation is just barely out of reach. In Old Joy, I think, friendship is a powerful, everlasting bond, simplifying and complicating communication in equal measure. On a very literal level, Mark and Kurt spend time together and enjoy each other's company. But what they take with them after the trip is the same isolation they entered with.